The call came just after sunrise on May 25, 2013. The voice on the other end was trembling, desperate, filled with a kind of fear that only comes when blood has already been spilled. "He's not breathing. Please, I don't know what to do. He's not breathing." The 911 operator's questions cut through the panic, but the answers were fragmented, disjointed confessions mixed with shock. "I shot my husband," the woman finally admitted. There was no accident in her tone. No denial. Only finality. That morning should have been a celebration. Marshall University was preparing to honor its graduates, families flocking to the campus to watch their children take a final step into adulthood. Among them should have been a man named Mark McDermot, a proud father who had worked for years to give his family everything they needed, and a son named Donald, whose long-awaited graduation was about to begin. But as neighbors gathered in caps and gowns, the McDermott household was about to become a crime scene that would shake an entire community. Mark was born in Australia in the early 1960s, the eldest of 5 siblings. Those who knew him described him as disciplined, responsible, and endlessly generous. When he eventually moved to the United States, his life took an unexpected turn. There he met Joanna, a single mother raising a 4-year-old boy. Mark fell in love with her quickly, and more importantly, he embraced her child, Donald, as though he were his own flesh and blood. Friends and family often marveled at their bond. Mark was not just a stepfather, he was the only father figure Donald ever knew. The McDermotts built a family that, from the outside, looked unshakable. They endured hardships, illness, separation, financial pressures, but they always found their way back to each other. When Joanna was diagnosed with cancer, Mark stood by her side. When Donald struggled as a teenager, Mark provided guidance, stability, and above all, unconditional love. Donald, too, seemed to recognize his stepfather's sacrifices. He lived modestly, never asking for much, and when he graduated high school in 2008, Mark took full responsibility for his education. From tuition fees to car insurance, from clothes to food, Mark made sure his son never went without. He believed in Donald's future so fiercely that he ignored his own needs to ensure Donald had every opportunity to succeed. For years, Donald played the role of the perfect student. He woke early, claimed to spend long hours in the library, and often skipped outings with friends to study. He gave his family no reason to doubt him. His life seemed to follow the script of a young man destined to make his parents proud. And then came graduation day. The house was quiet that morning. Joanna moved through her usual routine, unaware that by the end of the day she would be sitting in a police interrogation room, confessing to a crime that she claimed was not hers to commit. Upstairs, Donald showered, preparing for what was supposed to be the most important day of his life. And on the couch in the living room, Mark was stretched out with a book in his hands, unaware that he was minutes away from death. When the gunshots rang out, neighbors didn't hear them. The world outside remained oblivious. But inside, Mark slumped forward, his body absorbing 3 bullets. 2 to the head. 1 to the shoulder. He didn't die instantly. The medical examiner would later confirm that he had clung to life for several moments, bleeding out slowly, unable to cry for help. Joanna's 911 call painted the image of a domestic dispute gone horribly wrong. "We were fighting," she told the operator. Her words made it sound like a crime of passion, a sudden, uncontrollable burst of anger. The pistol, still warm, lay abandoned on the dining table beside a letter addressed to Donald. It was handwritten, filled with apologies and despair, explaining that the marriage had become unbearable. A note of farewell from a mother to her son on the very day he was supposed to be celebrated. But something about the scene didn't sit right with investigators. Joanna's shock was real, yes, but there was a tremor beneath it that didn't match the story she had given. When she was placed in the back of a patrol car, away from her son, her words shifted. "It wasn't me," she whispered. "It was Donald." That single revelation unraveled everything. What had appeared to be a straightforward case of domestic violence was suddenly a labyrinth of deception, betrayal, and premeditation. The boy who had been raised with every opportunity, who was loved and supported without condition, was now accused of pulling the trigger. A graduation gown hanging in his closet, ready for a day that would never come, stood as a chilling reminder of what his life should have been. Detectives knew then that this case was no longer about a tragic marital dispute. It was about something much darker, a carefully constructed lie that had been festering for years, waiting to explode. The moment Joanna whispered, "It was Donald," detectives felt the air in the interrogation room change. 4 hours, they had been piecing together a narrative of domestic tension, an argument between husband and wife that had ended in tragedy. Now, everything they thought they knew was shattered. The confession was cryptic, almost hesitant, but it was enough to redirect the entire investigation. Why would a mother protect her son by first claiming the crime as her own, only to later betray him with a single whispered truth? Was she lying to shield herself, or had her son actually turned the weapon on the man who had raised him? Detectives returned to the McDermott home, retracing each step of that horrific morning. The living room was eerily still, the faint smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. Crime scene technicians documented everything: the bloodstains on the carpet, the angle of the bullets, the placement of the gun. But one detail immediately raised suspicion: Donald's graduation gown. It was laid out perfectly in his room, pressed and ready, but his cap and tassel were missing. Where had he intended to go that day, and why hadn't he put them on? In the dining room, the letter on the table drew further attention. Handwritten with trembling strokes, it read like a suicide note. It spoke of marital unhappiness, of a life no longer bearable, of escape. But something about it felt staged. Investigators noticed that the handwriting was unusually neat for a note supposedly written in distress. And then came the most damning discovery: the fingerprints. Tests showed that Donald's prints were on the paper. His smudges appeared near the edges, not in a way that suggested casual handling, but as though he had placed it there intentionally. The theory began to form. Donald, the young man who had been handed every opportunity, had deceived his family for years. He was supposed to graduate that day, but records revealed a devastating truth: he hadn't been enrolled full-time at Marshall University for 2 years. He hadn't passed his required courses, hadn't even registered for some of them. The image of the dedicated student, buried in books at the library, was nothing more than a facade. Mark had been paying tuition the entire time. Thousands of dollars had vanished into an institution that Donald rarely even attended. And still, Donald lied, every day, every week, every year, carefully constructing a false version of himself to keep his parents' pride alive. As detectives dug deeper, a timeline emerged. The morning of May 25th, Donald was supposed to be at graduation rehearsal. Instead, he stayed home. He had told his parents he was walking across the stage that afternoon, wearing the gown and cap Mark had likely paid for. But Donald knew the truth: there would be no ceremony, no diploma, no future worth celebrating. His web of lies was seconds from collapsing, and his parents would finally see him for what he was: a fraud. The thought of facing that shame, of letting down the man who had sacrificed everything for him, may have been unbearable. But did it truly drive him to murder? Neighbors began telling detectives that they had heard muffled arguments in the McDermott house in the weeks leading up to graduation. One even recalled hearing Donald's raised voice, unusual for someone typically quiet and reserved. Another mentioned how nervous he seemed in the days before May 25th, pacing outside, chain-smoking, lost in thought. When Donald was finally brought in for questioning, his demeanor was cold, almost disturbingly calm. While his mother wept uncontrollably, insisting she had nothing to do with the crime, Donald sat motionless, answering questions with clipped, rehearsed responses. He never once asked about Mark. He never expressed concern for his mother. His only repeated question was, "Am I free to leave now?" Detectives leaned into his silence, presenting piece after piece of evidence. The fingerprints on the note, the financial records from Marshall, the bullet trajectory suggesting the shooter had fired from a standing position over the couch. Donald's composure cracked only once, when he was asked why his father had 3 bullets in his body. His lips twitched as if he wanted to respond but couldn't find the words. By the end of the day, police had enough to hold him. The story that had begun with a mother's desperate 911 call had twisted into something far more sinister. This wasn't just about murder. It was about betrayal. About a son destroying the very man who had given him everything. As the sun set over Huntington that evening, Mark's body was taken to the morgue for autopsy. Joanna sat alone in a holding cell, her face pale and drawn, wondering how her son, the boy she had once cradled in her arms, could be capable of such horror. And upstairs in the evidence room, Donald's graduation gown lay folded, untouched. A symbol of a future that had never existed. The walls of the Huntington Police Department held secrets that night, but none heavier than the truth closing in on Donald McDermott. Outside, the town was still buzzing with celebration. Caps tossed in the air, families crowding restaurants, graduates smiling for photographs. But inside, Donald sat in silence, the weight of his lies pressing down on him like iron shackles. Detectives weren't done. They wanted more than suspicion. They wanted proof beyond all doubt. The autopsy results came back swiftly. The medical examiner confirmed that Mark had been shot 3 times at close range. 1 bullet to the shoulder, 2 to the head. The angles suggested the shooter had been standing over him, firing downward. Mark had been lounging on the couch, completely unguarded, a book still in his hands. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. Whoever pulled the trigger, Mark had trusted them enough not to flinch. The detail that unsettled investigators most was Mark's slow death. He hadn't died instantly. He had lingered, breathing shallowly, bleeding heavily, until his heart finally gave out. The cruel deliberation of the attack made one thing clear. This was no impulsive act of rage. It was an execution. And then there was the letter. The so-called suicide note. Handwriting analysts compared it with samples from Joanna and Donald. The flow of the letters, the pressure of the pen, the careful loops, it was almost certainly Donald's. But the note wasn't just a clumsy attempt at misdirection. It was written like a stage script, designed to shift blame toward Joanna, to cast the crime as a desperate act of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage. As evidence mounted, detectives turned their attention to Donald's past. They traced his academic history at Marshall University, and the findings were devastating. Donald hadn't just fallen behind, he had failed spectacularly. 4 years he had told his parents he was earning credits, passing courses, and working toward a degree in biology. But transcripts revealed the truth. He hadn't been a full-time student since 2011. In fact, his name wasn't even on the graduation roster for 2013. All the early mornings, the library visits, the stress he pretended to carry, it was nothing but theater. He had built an illusion brick by brick to maintain his parents' pride and avoid confrontation. But illusions collapse. And when they do, they leave only ruin behind. Detectives pieced together what likely happened on that fateful morning. Donald, knowing graduation day would expose him, decided he couldn't face the humiliation. Worse, he couldn't face Mark, the man who had given him everything. To stand there and admit he had wasted thousands of dollars, squandered years, and lied about it all was more than he could bear. So he made a choice. A final, irreversible choice. The pistol used in the murder had been registered to Joanna, kept in the house for protection. Donald knew where it was stored. He knew the weight of it in his hands. The evidence showed he retrieved it, approached his unsuspecting stepfather on the couch and fired 3 times. He then planted the gun and note in a way that pointed suspicion at his mother. It was a plan born of desperation, not intelligence. Still, when confronted with the evidence, Donald showed no emotion. Detectives slid the transcripts across the table, highlighting the gaps in his education. They showed him photographs of the crime scene, the letter with his fingerprints, the bullet casings matching his fingerprints as well. Donald stared at each item with the detachment of a man reading about a stranger. His mother, however, was breaking apart. Joanna sobbed uncontrollably during her interviews, begging detectives to believe that she had no part in the murder. "He's my son," she kept saying. "He wouldn't do this. He couldn't." But when she was told the evidence pointed directly at him, she faltered. Her eyes widened in disbelief, as though she were realizing for the first time who her son really was. The boy she had once defended at all costs, the boy she believed incapable of violence, had betrayed not just her but the man who had raised him. Donald's arrest was swift. Word spread quickly, casting a shadow over the graduation celebrations. News outlets began running the story. Graduate accused of killing father on graduation day. The irony was too dark to ignore, too cruel to forget. Neighbors shook their heads in disbelief. "Mark was a good man," one said. "He worked hard, always took care of his family. He didn't deserve this." Another added, "Donald always seemed polite, quiet. I never thought he could." But the truth was out. Donald had taken his father's life in cold blood. And worse, he had tried to frame his mother for the crime. The question that haunted detectives wasn't whether he had done it. The evidence was undeniable. The question was why. Was it pride? Fear? Hatred? Or simply the unbearable weight of a lie he had spun too far to escape? Whatever the reason, the crime had destroyed what was left of the McDermot family. A mother in shock, a father buried too soon, and a son awaiting trial for the murder of the only man who had ever truly loved him. And yet, as dark as the truth was, it was only the beginning. The courthouse in Huntington was packed the day Donald McDermott's trial began. Reporters lined the steps, their cameras flashing, capturing the image of a young man in a suit far too large for him, his wrists bound in handcuffs, eyes fixed straight ahead. The irony was thick in the air. He should have been walking across a stage in a cap and gown, but instead he was being led into a courtroom to face judgment for his father's murder. The prosecution wasted no time in painting Donald as a manipulator. They laid out the timeline with precision. How he had stopped being a full-time student in 2011, how he had faked an entire college career, how he had prepared his family for a graduation that never existed. When the truth threatened to unravel, they argued he chose murder over humiliation. They displayed the suicide note to the jury, highlighting the neat handwriting, the misplaced fingerprints, the calculated attempt to frame Joanna. Then came the financial records, proving Mark had poured thousands of dollars into a lie. Finally, they revealed the damning evidence. The fingerprints on the bullet casings, the angle of the shots, the cold deliberation of a son standing over his father as he fired. But the most powerful testimony came not from experts or police, but from Joanna herself. When she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She looked smaller than she had months earlier, fragile, her voice trembling as she recounted the morning of May 25th. She described how she heard the gunshots, how she saw Mark slump forward, how she found Donald with the pistol in his hand. She admitted, through tears, that at first she lied to protect him. "He's my son," she told the jury, her voice cracking. "I wanted to believe there was some mistake. But there wasn't." Her words broke what little sympathy remained for Donald. The jury saw not just a son who had betrayed his father, but one who had nearly destroyed his mother's life by trying to frame her. The defense attempted to counter by painting Donald as mentally unstable, overwhelmed by pressure and expectations. They argued he acted in a moment of fear, not cold calculation. But the evidence told a different story. The careful staging of the note, the placement of the gun, the absence of panic in his behavior, all suggested a man who knew exactly what he was doing. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments rang through the courtroom. The prosecution called it a crime of betrayal, while the defense pleaded for mercy. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of the decision heavy in the silence of the jury room. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Guilty of first-degree murder. Donald stood as the words were read, but his face remained expressionless. No tears, no outburst, only the same cold, detached demeanor he had shown since the day of his arrest. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. With that, Donald's future ended, not with applause or celebration but with shackles and a cell door. Outside, reporters swarmed Joanna as she left the courthouse. She said nothing. Her eyes were hollow, her steps slow. She had lost her husband to violence, her son to justice. Nothing remained of the family she had once built. In the years since, neighbors in Huntington still speak of the McDermot case in hushed tones. Some say they remember seeing Donald walk to the bus stop in his gown that morning, trying to keep up the illusion until the very last moment. Others remember Mark's kindness, how he would mow a neighbor's lawn or fix a broken pipe without asking for anything in return. The tragedy lies not only in Mark's death, but in the cruel irony that the man who gave everything to his son was repaid with betrayal. And that graduation gown, folded neatly in an evidence box, still lingers as the most haunting symbol of all. A life that could have been, a future that never was, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers don't come from strangers in the dark, but from the people we trust most.